The scent of damp soil, crushed pine needles, and tracing ammonia was the only atmosphere Langston Pierce had truly felt at home in for 30 years. In the dimly lit basement office of Pierce & Associates, Langston leaned over a sprawling oak drafting table, a soft lead pencil held between his calloused, dark fingers. His broad shoulders, built from years of physical labor, before he ever designed a single park, were hunched under the low-hanging green-shaded lamp. He was meticulously hand-drawing the root system for a series of weeping willows. It was for the Oasis, a massive, multi-million-dollar eco-park project that was supposed to be the crowning achievement of the boutique firm he had founded. But upstairs, in the bright, modern, glass-walled offices, a different kind of draft was blowing. For the past year, the warmth had slowly drained from Langston's home. His wife, Evelyn, who handled the financial and public-facing side of the business, had grown cold and distant. She no longer looked at his hand-drawn blueprints with pride. Instead, she spoke only of margins, acquisitions, and the lifestyle she felt she was owed. And then there was Malcolm, their 23-year-old son. Langston had worked 80-hour weeks to pay for Malcolm's prestigious Ivy League business degree. But when Malcolm returned, he didn't want to learn the honest craft of the soil. He wore tailored Italian suits, spoke in sharp corporate jargon, and looked at his father's dirt-stained work boots with a quiet, polite disgust. "You're still using pencils, Dad." Malcolm's voice cut through the quiet hum of the basement. He stood at the bottom of the wooden stairs, checking his gold watch. "We have the final presentation with the Caldwell Group in an hour. Harrison Caldwell doesn't want to see sketches. He wants 3D digital renderings." Langston didn't look up immediately. He carefully finished shading a root contour before raising his head. His deep, dark eyes, lined with the wisdom of a man who understood how things grew, locked onto his son. "Digital renderings don't show the clay density, Malcolm," Langston said, his voice a low, steady baritone. "If you don't design the drainage around the actual slope of the land, the roots will rot. A computer doesn't feel the dirt." "The dirt doesn't make us rich, Langston." Evelyn's voice was sharp as she descended the stairs. She was impeccably dressed in an expensive cream suit, her hair styled to perfection. She didn't look at her husband. She looked at the blueprints on the table with an impatient sigh. "Harrison Caldwell is bringing a buyout offer today." "A real offer. We're talking about retiring in the hills, Langston. No more muddy boots. No more drafting in a basement." Langston slowly stood up to his full, imposing height. "I told you, Evelyn, we are not selling. Pierce & Associates is a family legacy. It's what we build for Malcolm's future." Evelyn exchanged a brief, unreadable look with Malcolm, a look that sent a cold, sudden chill down Langston's spine. "Of course, dear," Evelyn said, her voice turning artificially soft as she adjusted her silk scarf. "We're just preparing the paperwork for the meeting. Why don't you head over to the nursery to check on the willow saplings? Malcolm and I will handle the initial presentation with Caldwell." Langston looked at his wife, then at the son who refused to meet his eyes. The silence in the basement was heavy, thick with things unsaid. For a fleeting second, Langston felt the fragile thread of his family slipping through his fingers. But he nodded, reaching for his worn leather jacket. "All right," Langston said quietly. "I'll check the trees." He didn't know that by the time he returned, the trees would be the only thing he had left. The nursery was quiet, but Langston's mind was not. As he ran his hands over the rough bark of the willow saplings, a persistent, hollow ache settled deep in his chest. The look Evelyn and Malcolm had shared back at the office wasn't just distant, it was calculated. Unable to shake the unease, Langston bypassed his usual evening routine and drove back to the office early. The main parking lot was empty, save for a sleek, midnight black Mercedes belonging to Harrison Caldwell. Langston entered through the basement side door, his heavy boots making no sound on the old concrete. He intended to slip back to his drafting table, but the sound of laughter drifting down the open ventilation shaft stopped him cold. "To a new era, Evelyn," Harrison Caldwell's smooth, arrogant voice echoed clearly from the upstairs boardroom. The clink of crystal glasses followed. With Langston out of the way, we can break ground on the luxury condominiums by next month. The board is thrilled. It took long enough, Evelyn replied, her tone lighter and far more intimate than Langston had heard in years. He's spent 30 years playing in the mud. He was never going to let us sell. Langston froze in the dim hallway, the air suddenly turning to ice in his lungs. He walked silently up the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Through the crack of the double mahogany doors, he saw them. Evelyn was standing close to Caldwell, her hand resting familiarly on the wealthy developer's arm. But it was Malcolm who stood at the head of the conference table, holding a thick stack of legal documents. "We've finalized the intellectual property transfer," Malcolm said, his voice flat, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. Every single hand-drawn blueprint, the soil drainage patents, and the master design for the oasis are now legally owned by the Caldwell Group. "And you're sure your father didn't suspect anything when you had him sign the transfer deeds?" Caldwell asked, a smug grin spreading across his face. Malcolm shrugged, setting down his pen. "He didn't sign them. I did." Langston's breath caught in his throat. "I've spent the last 3 weeks perfecting his signature on the digital tablet," Malcolm continued, looking up at his mother with a cold, triumphant smile. "The notary is a friend of mine from college." He cleared the verification without a second look. "As far as the state is concerned, Langston Pierce signed over 100% of his shares and his creative patents to my mother's holding company yesterday, and today we sell." "You did beautifully, sweetheart," Evelyn murmured, leaning over to kiss Malcolm's cheek. "Your father is a good man, but he has no vision. He would have kept us trapped in this dusty office forever." In the shadows of the hallway, Langston felt a pain so sharp and deep it physicalized as a dull ache in his jaw. The betrayal didn't just hurt, it tore at the very foundation of his life. He had bled for this company. He had skipped meals so Malcolm could go to schools where he learned how to forge his own father's name. Slowly, Langston reached out and pushed the heavy mahogany doors wide open. The hinges let out a low, mourning creak. The laughter in the room died instantly. Evelyn gasped, her face draining of all color as she took a sudden step back from Caldwell. Malcolm froze, his hand still resting on the forged documents, his eyes widening in sheer, primal terror as he looked at the towering figure of his father standing in the doorway. Langston did not yell. He did not charge. He simply stood there, his dark eyes locked onto his son, carrying the quiet, crushing weight of a lifetime of broken trust. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, heavy with the sudden scent of ozone and fear. The brilliant afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling glass, illuminating the dust motes dancing between Langston and his family. For 10 agonizing seconds, Langston did not move. His large hands, stained with the gray grime of the nursery soil, hung loosely at his sides. His gaze, slow and crushing, drifted from the crystal whiskey glasses to Harrison Caldwell's smug, fading grin, to his wife, and finally settled on his son. Malcolm's hand was still hovering over the forged documents. He tried to pull his shoulders back, to summon the expensive confidence his Ivy League education was supposed to provide, but his fingers trembled against the paper. "Dad," Malcolm stammered, his voice losing its corporate polish. It's not what it looks like." "Quiet, Malcolm," Langston said. His voice wasn't a roar. It was a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to shake the very glass walls of the room. He stepped inside, his heavy work boots leaving faint, damp smudges of soil on the pristine white carpet. He walked directly to the table, ignoring Caldwell entirely, and stared down at the documents. There it was, Langston Pierce, written in a smooth, digital cursive that mimicry had perfected, but missing the slight, jagged skip at the end of the P where Langston's knuckle, broken 20 years ago on a construction site, always stiffened. "You forged my name, Malcolm," Langston said quietly, his eyes never leaving the paper. "The name I gave you. The name I worked 30 years to make mean something." "Langston, be reasonable," Evelyn interrupted, stepping in front of her son. The initial shock had faded from her face, replaced by a cold, defensive mask. She crossed her arms, her diamond rings catching the light. You were never going to let us sell. You wanted to die at that drafting table. But Malcolm and I deserve a life. We built this company too. You built the ledger. I built the dirt, Langston said, finally raising his head to look at her. The love that had survived 30 years of marriage vanished from his eyes in an instant, leaving only a vast, empty canyon. And you let him do this. You let our son become a thief. He's not a thief. He's a businessman. Evelyn snapped, her voice rising, sharp and defensive. Harrison is offering $25 million. Do you have any idea what that means? We are talking about generational wealth. We are talking about never having to worry again. You would have thrown that away for trees. Harrison Caldwell chuckled softly, leaning back against the mahogany sideboard, swirling his whiskey. Let's keep it professional, Langston. The paperwork is filed. The notary has signed off. Legally, the IP belongs to the holding company, and the holding company has just closed the deal with me. It's over. You can make a scene, or you can walk away with a quiet, comfortable severance. Langston slowly turned his head to look at Caldwell. The sheer, physical presence of the older man, the broad chest, the thick, powerful neck, and the eyes that had seen the hardest parts of life made Caldwell's smile falter. The developer slowly set his glass down. I wasn't speaking to you, Langston said to Caldwell. He looked back at Malcolm. The boy was staring at the floor, unable to meet his father's eyes. Look at me, son, Langston commanded. Malcolm slowly lifted his chin, his face pale, sweat bead lining his forehead. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Langston asked, his voice cracking slightly with the first sign of real, raw pain. Or did you just not care? I had to do it, Dad, Malcolm whispered, his voice trembling but hardening. Your way, it's too slow. You're living in the past. We have to scale, we have to grow. I didn't want to spend my life in a basement drawing roots. The words were a final, clean blade through Langston's heart. He closed his eyes for a brief second, absorbing the blow. When he opened them, the pain was gone. In its place was a cold, iron resolve. All right, Langston said. All right? Evelyn repeated, her voice laced with a mixture of disbelief and lingering suspicion. She stepped closer to Malcolm, her eyes scanning Langston's face for any sign of a sudden outburst. That's all you have to say? There is nothing more to say to people who use the cover of darkness to rob their own blood, Langston said, his voice dropping into a flat, eerie calm. He didn't grab the papers. He didn't slam his fists. Instead, Langston slowly reached into his front pocket and pulled out his heavy brass keychain. The keys to the main office, the basement workshop, the nursery gates, and the supply trucks clinked softly in the silent boardroom. He placed them on the glass table. They landed with a heavy, definitive thud right next to the forged documents. You wanted the company, Evelyn. You wanted the title, Malcolm, Langston said, looking at them both. You have them, but you don't have me. Harrison Caldwell let out a dry, relieved chuckle, straightening his designer suit jacket. A sensible choice, Langston. I'll have my legal team draft a standard non-disclosure and exit agreement. We'll make sure your personal belongings are boxed up and sent to your home by tomorrow morning. No need, Langston replied, his dark eyes locking onto Caldwell with a chilling intensity. I'll take what's mine right now. Langston turned and walked out of the boardroom. His heavy boots thudded down the hallway, down the stairs, and back into the dim basement office. Evelyn and Malcolm followed at a distance, watching from the bottom of the stairs like trespassers in a temple they had just desecrated. Langston didn't touch the filing cabinets. He didn't touch the computers. He walked over to his old oak drafting table, picked up his leather-bound sketchbook, his personal drawing pencils, and a small, worn leather pouch containing his grandfather's hand-carved wooden leveling tool. He placed them into his old canvas duffel bag. Finally, he looked at his hand-drawn blueprint of the oasis resting on the table. He didn't tear it. He simply rolled it up, slid it into a protective cardboard tube, and slung his bag over his shoulder. "You can't take that blueprint, Langston," Evelyn said, her voice sharp as she stood at the edge of the room. "That belongs to the Caldwell Group now." Langston paused, his back to her. He slowly turned his head. "This paper is just carbon and ink, Evelyn. The real blueprint is in my head. And you couldn't buy that if you spent every dollar Caldwell's." He walked past them, his shoulder brushing Malcolm's arm. Malcolm flinched, stepping back into the shadow of the staircase. He looked at his father's face, searching for anger, but found only a devastating, quiet disappointment that made him feel smaller than he ever had in his life. Langston walked up the stairs, through the glass lobby, and out into the cool evening air. Behind him, the heavy glass doors of Pierce and Associates clicked shut, the automatic security locks engaging with a cold, metallic snap. Standing on the pavement, Langston took a deep breath of the damp evening air. For 30 years, he had anchored his life to that building, believing he was building a legacy for a family that loved him. Now, he stood in the parking lot with nothing but a canvas bag and a broken heart. He walked to his old, dented Ford pickup truck. As he started the engine, the headlamps flickered to life, illuminating the towering glass facade of the office building. He didn't look back. He shifted into gear and drove out into the dark, leaving the quiet ashes of his past behind. The rain in the outer valley was different from the rain in the city. It didn't wash off clean asphalt. It soaked heavy and deep into the red clay of the old Pierce homestead. 30 miles north of the glass towers, Langston sat on the porch of the small, weathered cedar cabin his grandfather had built. The air here was clean, smelling of wet slate, wild sage, and wood smoke. For 3 days, Langston had not spoken. He sat in a creaking wicker chair, his large, dark hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, watching the mist roll over the overgrown apple orchard. He was a man accustomed to silence, but this silence was heavier, filled with the phantom echoes of Malcolm's forgery and Evelyn's cold betrayal. On the 4th morning, a low, familiar rumble broke the quiet of the valley. A battered, mud-splattered flatbed truck pulled up the gravel driveway, followed by 2 weathered pickup trucks. The engines cut out. From the trucks climbed 3 men, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, and wearing high-visibility work jackets stained with concrete and oil. These were the foremen of the oldest grading and masonry crews in the county. At the front was Booker Vance, a man with silvering hair and hands like oak knots, who had laid stone alongside Langston since they were teenagers. Booker walked up the wooden steps of the porch, his heavy boots thudding softly. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't offer pity. He simply leaned against the porch railing and looked out at the orchard. "We heard what happened at the office, Langston," Booker said, his voice like gravel sliding down a chute. "The corporate suits showed up yesterday with Caldwell's logo on their trucks. They told us we're reporting to some kid named Malcolm now." Langston took a slow sip of his coffee. "He's got the paperwork, Booker. He's got the signature." "He's got a piece of paper, Langston," Booker spat, shaking his head. "But he don't know the difference between topsoil and quicksand. That boy tried to tell Marcus and the grading crew that we don't need to dig out the silt deposits along the creek bed for the oasis. Said the digital model showed the ground was stable enough." A quiet, grim smile played at the corner of Langston's mouth. "The digital model doesn't know the creek floods every November." "Exactly," Booker said, turning his piercing gaze directly onto his old friend. "The crews aren't starting, Langston. We told the kid we don't lay a single stone or dig a single trench without your stamp on the physical blueprints. We've been working for you for 25 years. Not Evelyn, not the boy, and sure as hell not Harrison Caldwell." Langston looked at Booker, then passed him to the men waiting by the trucks. They were honest men who lived by the sweat of their brow, men who had trusted Langston to keep them safe and paid through winter freezes and summer droughts. In the darkest moments of his betrayal, he had thought he was completely alone. But as he looked at their stubborn, mud-stained faces, he realized that a man's true legacy isn't built on corporate shares. It is built in the trust of the people who help him move the earth. He set his coffee mug down on the wooden table. For the first time in 4 days, the hollow ache in his chest was replaced by a cold, burning purpose. "Booker," Langston said, standing up to his full height, "have they started excavation on the western slope of the park yet?" "They're bringing the heavy bulldozers in tomorrow morning," Booker replied, his eyes narrowing with sudden anticipation. "They're going to hit the shale shelf," Langston said quietly, walking to his canvas bag and pulling out his hand-drawn blueprints. "And when they do, the whole hillside is going to slide. Let them dig, Booker. Don't stop them, but tell the men to keep their distance." The western slope of the oasis was a steep, sweeping hillside designed to overlook the central lake. On Malcolm's digital renderings, it was a flawless, terraced amphitheater of lush green grass and heavy stone retaining walls. But the digital model didn't account for the ancient geology of the valley. At 7 o'clock on Thursday morning, the roar of massive yellow excavators tore through the quiet of the construction site. Evelyn stood near the temporary mobile office trailer, shielding her eyes from the dust. She wore a pristine white hard hat that looked ridiculously clean, her designer boots wrapped in plastic protectors. Beside her, Harrison Caldwell paced back and forth, bark ordering commands into his phone, while Malcolm stood near the edge of the excavation pit, waving a tablet at the heavy machine operators. "Tell them to dig deeper," Malcolm shouted over the engine roar to the lead excavator operator. "The foundation piles for the main pavilion have to go down 12 feet. We're behind schedule." The operator, a seasoned worker named Marcus, who had worked under Langston for a decade, cut the engine to idle. He leaned out of the cab, his face etched with deep concern. "Kid, we hit a shale shelf 6 feet down. It's wet clay underneath. If we cut any deeper into the toe of this slope without putting in temporary shoring, the whole hillside is going to lose its footing." The engineering software verified the soil load. "Marcus," Malcolm snapped, his voice tight and defensive. He tapped his tablet screen aggressively. "The sheer strength of this sector is well within the safety margins. Just do your job. We have the board inspectors coming in 48 hours. Marcus looked past Malcolm toward the edge of the tree line, where Booker Vance stood leaning against his pickup truck, arms crossed, watching silently. Booker gave a slow, barely perceptible shake of his head. Marcus turned back to Malcolm, his jaw tight. "It's your funeral, boss." He restarted the engine and lowered the massive steel bucket into the earth. The steel teeth of the excavator tore into the gray, slick shale. A wet, grinding sound echoed through the valley. For 3 hours the excavation continued, but as the afternoon heat began to bake the exposed clay, the earth began to speak. It started with a sound like a pistol shot, a sharp, violent crack deep beneath the surface of the hill. Malcolm jumped, looking around in confusion. What was that? "Get the machines out, now!" Marcus yelled, already shifting his excavator into reverse, the heavy tracks clattering frantically as he backed the multi-ton machine away from the pit. A spiderweb of deep, dark fissures zipped across the terraced slope. The ground beneath Malcolm's feet groaned. "Malcolm, get back!" Evelyn screamed from the safety of the gravel road. Before Malcolm could run, a massive portion of the hillside, nearly 80,000 tons of wet clay and shattered shale liquefied. The slope gave way in a slow, terrifying wave of mud, sliding forward like thick soup. It swallowed the freshly laid concrete footings, snapped the steel rebar like toothpicks, and buried the main utility lines under 10 feet of heavy, gray debris. The roar of the landslide finally subsided, leaving a suffocating cloud of dust and the sharp smell of ruptured gas lines hanging in the air. Malcolm fell to his knees on the edge of the slide, his expensive tablet dropping into the mud, its screen shattering instantly. His hands trembled as he stared at the disaster. The entire western sector of the project, the crowning jewel of the Caldwell acquisition, was completely destroyed. The cost to excavate, stabilize, and rebuild the slope would run into millions, and the delay would trigger massive, ruinous penalties from the city. Harrison Caldwell walked slowly to the edge of the mud, his face twisted in a mixture of shock and white-hot fury. He looked at the ruined hillside, then turned his glare onto Malcolm, who looked smaller than he ever had in his life. "Your digital model," Caldwell hissed, his voice trembling with rage, "just cost $5 million in 3 seconds. Fix this, Malcolm, or I will personally ensure you and your mother spend the next decade in bankruptcy court." The rain returned to the valley, but it brought no relief to the executive offices of the Caldwell Group. Inside the high-rise boardroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. The polished glass table was no longer neat. It was buried under frantic geological reports, red-inked financial ledgers, and formal notices of safety violations from the city's building department. Malcolm sat with his head in his hands, his expensive suit jacket discarded over the back of his chair. His collar was unbuttoned, his hair disheveled. Across from him, Evelyn paced the length of the room, her high heels clicking like a countdown timer. "The city inspectors just issued a stop-work order on the entire park," Evelyn said, her voice high and thin with panic. "They're threatening to pull our municipal license, Malcolm. The board is calling for an emergency audit of the intellectual property we sold them. They want to know why our engineering schematics didn't include the shale shelf anomalies." "Because they weren't in the digital scans," Malcolm cried out, slamming his palms onto the table. "The geological database we bought from the state was 10 years old. It didn't have the updated core drill data." "But your father did," Evelyn whispered, stopping in her tracks. Her face was pale, the lines of stress showing clearly beneath her makeup. "He had 30 years of physical soil samples in those old wooden drawers in the basement. He kept the regional water table maps from the 50s. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open, and Harrison Caldwell walked in. The smug, smooth developer was gone. In his place was a desperate, angry predator. He didn't sit down. He walked straight to the table and threw a thick leather folder in front of Malcolm. "The city's chief engineer just called," Caldwell said, his voice deadly quiet. "They will not allow us to touch that slope again without a signed, stamped geological mitigation plan from a licensed landscape architect who has local soil remediation credentials. I've called every major firm in the state. No one will touch this. The risk of another slide is too high, and my company's insurance is about to cancel our policy." Caldwell leaned over the table, his shadow swallowing Malcolm. "I bought a turnkey operation, Malcolm. I bought Pierce & Associates because of the Pierce name and the Pierce reputation. But right now, all I have is a muddy pit and a massive lawsuit. If this project dies, your holding company goes down first. I will claw back every single dollar of the acquisition money, and I will sue you both for fraud." "Fraud?" Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Harrison, we have a partnership. We had a deal based on valid, usable patents and designs," Caldwell snarled. "But your son forged the transfer deeds, and your husband is the only one who actually holds the state license for the soil remediation patents we need to fix that hill. Without Langston's personal, hand-signed approval on the remediation drafts, those patents are legally locked in probate. The city won't accept your digital signature, Malcolm. They want the man who registered the original designs." The silence that followed was deafening. Malcolm looked at his mother. The cold, triumphant glory they had shared just days ago had completely evaporated, leaving only the grim, terrifying reality of their betrayal. They had stolen the house, the name, and the office, but they had locked themselves inside a burning building without the key. "We have to go to him," Evelyn said, her voice trembling as she looked at her son. Malcolm's stomach churned. The thought of facing his father, of driving out to the old cedar cabin in the dirt he had so deeply despised, felt like swallowing glass. "He won't help us, Mom. You saw his eyes. He's done with us." "He is your father, Malcolm," Evelyn snapped, a sudden, desperate anger breaking through her fear. "He loved you. He built this entire Kyer company for you. If you don't go out there and get him to sign those remediation drafts, we are going to prison. Do you understand me? You will go to that cabin and you will beg." The rain had slowed to a heavy, rhythmic dripping off the cedar eaves of the cabin. Inside, the only light came from the orange glow of a wood-burning stove. Langston sat at his clean pine table, slowly turning the pages of his grandfather's hand-written journal on forestry. The air smelled of wood smoke and dried peppermint. The sound of tires crunching on wet gravel broke the quiet. Langston didn't stand up. He didn't close his book. He simply listened to the hesitant, uneven footsteps ascending the wooden porch stairs. The screen door creaked, followed by a soft, trembling knock. "Enter," Langston said, his voice flat and steady. The door opened, and Malcolm stepped into the warm cabin. His designer shoes were caked in red mud, and his expensive wool coat was damp and shapeless from the rain. He stood in the doorway, clutching a leather folder tightly against his chest like a shield. He looked pale, hollow-eyed, and completely stripped of his corporate arrogance. For a long moment, Langston just looked at him. The silence was deafening, filled only by the crackle of the wood stove. "Dad," Malcolm whispered, his voice cracking on the single syllable. Langston turned a page in his book. "You're a long way from the high-rise, Malcolm. Did the pavement run out?" Malcolm took a tentative step forward, his chest heaving as he fought back tears. "The western slope. It collapsed, Dad. The whole hill slid into the lake basin. The city shut the project down. Caldwell, he's pulling the funding. He's going to sue us. He's going to sue Mom and me for fraud, because of the transfer signatures." Langston did not look up from his text. "The shale shelf. I told you it was there. I spent 3 years mapping it." "I know," Malcolm choked out, taking another step closer. He placed the leather folder on the pine table, his hands trembling violently. "I was wrong. I thought the software knew better. I thought I could run the business without the dirt. But the city won't let us touch the site without a signed soil remediation plan under your license. The patents are locked. We need your hand-signed seal, Dad. If we don't get it, the company is bankrupt and they might file criminal charges against me." Malcolm sank into the wooden chair opposite his father, his head dropping into his hands. "Please, Dad, I'm begging you. Just sign the mitigation drafts. We'll give you back your shares. We'll give you whatever you want. Just don't let them ruin us." Langston slowly closed the old journal. He placed his large, dark hands flat on the table, looking at the leather folder containing the drafts, then up at his son. There was no anger in Langston's eyes, no heat, no thirst for vengeance. There was only a vast, cold distance that felt far worse than rage. "When you forged my name, Malcolm," Langston said softly, "you didn't just steal my company. You looked at my 30 years of labor, my sweat, and the broken bones in my hands, and you decided they had no value. You decided I had no value. Dad, I was stupid." "You weren't stupid, Malcolm. You were greedy," Langston interrupted, his voice dropping into a deep, unyielding register. "You and your mother wanted the harvest, but you didn't want to tend the soil. And now that the winter has come and the ground is frozen, you come back to the man you cast out, asking him to warm you by his fire." Langston pushed the leather folder back across the table, untouched. "I won't sign it," Langston said. Malcolm gasped, his eyes wide with sheer panic. "Dad, please. They will take everything. The house, our savings. I could go to jail. I'm your son!" "A son doesn't write his father's name in stolen ink," Langston said, standing up to his full, towering height. His shadow fell over Malcolm, heavy and absolute. "You built your house on sand, Malcolm, and you used my name to cement the foundation. Now the rain has come, and it is washing away. I will not lay my hands to a crooked wall to keep it from falling on you." He walked to the cabin door and opened it, letting the cool, damp night air rush into the warm room. "Go back to your mother," Langston said, his face carved of granite, "and tell Harrison Caldwell that if he wants to build in this valley, he'll have to find a way to move the shale himself. The county courthouse was a century-old limestone structure, built long before the glass towers of the Caldwell Group ever touched the sky. Inside courtroom 302, the air was cool, smelling of old paper and heavy oak. 2 months after the landslide, the final hearing regarding the disputed ownership and environmental liabilities of the Oasis had drawn a crowd. On the left side of the aisle sat Evelyn and Malcolm, flanked by 3 high-priced corporate defense attorneys. They looked pale and diminished. Evelyn's expensive cream suits had been replaced by a quiet, dark charcoal dress. Malcolm sat with his shoulders hunched, staring blankly at his own hands. Behind them sat Harrison Caldwell, his eyes dark with fury, accompanied by his own team of legal counsel. On the right side of the aisle sat Langston Pierce. He wore his navy blue suit, his shoulders broad and straight, his large hands resting calmly on his knees. He didn't have a team of corporate lawyers. He sat next to a single, sharp public interest attorney, and behind him sat Booker Vance and 10 of his senior crew leaders, their presence silent and formidable. The judge, an older woman with sharp gray eyes, adjusted her glasses as she looked over the thick stack of documents on her bench. "We are here to resolve the motion for immediate summary judgment regarding the intellectual property of Pierce and Associates," the judge began, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Mr. Caldwell's legal team argues that the digital transfer of the soil remediation patents and design blueprints is legally binding, signed by Langston Pierce on the 14th of February. They are requesting the court to compel Mr. Pierce to sign off on the emergency municipal remediation drafts." Caldwell's lead attorney stood up, adjusting his cuffs. "Your Honor, the city is holding my client liable for millions in daily fines due to the slide. The patents belong to the holding company now. Mr. Pierce's refusal to sign the engineering drafts is an act of bad faith sabotage against his own former firm and our partnership." "The partnership was built on a lie," Langston's attorney said, standing up. "Your Honor, we submit into evidence the original, hand-drawn blueprints of the Oasis, registered and stamped by Langston Pierce at the State Forestry and Soil Conservation Archive 10 years ago." She placed a large, heavy cardboard tube onto the presentation easel. From it, she pulled the original, hand-shaded drawing of the western slope, the very blueprint Langston had carried out of his basement office in his canvas bag. "If you look at the lower margin of the original document," the attorney continued, "you will see a micro-embossed, physical seal that Langston Pierce placed on every master design. This seal requires a physical, ink-based registration key. More importantly, we have the forensic handwriting report regarding the digital signature on the transfer deeds." The courtroom went quiet. Malcolm sank lower into his seat. "The digital signature was executed on a tablet owned by Malcolm Pierce," the attorney stated, her voice clear and precise. "The forensic analysis shows the stroke pressure, angle, and velocity do not match Langston Pierce's physical hand. They match Malcolm Pierce's exact digital drawing profile, recorded on his university design account. It is a forgery." The judge looked over her glasses at Malcolm. "Mr. Malcolm Pierce, do you deny these findings?" Malcolm looked at his mother, then at Caldwell, who was staring at him with cold, murderous intent. The boy's throat clicked as he tried to swallow. He looked across the room at his father. Langston's face was unreadable, not angry, not triumphant, just waiting for the truth to finally be spoken in the light. "No, Your Honor," Malcolm whispered, his voice barely audible. I signed it." Evelyn closed her eyes, a single tear cutting through her makeup. Harrison Caldwell let out a sharp, disgusted breath and leaned back, signaling his lawyers to immediately distance his firm from the mother and son. "Then the transfer is null and void," the judge declared, her gavel coming down with a sharp, echoing crack. "The court rules that 100% of the intellectual property, patents, and the name of Pierce and Associates remain the sole property of Langston Pierce. Furthermore, due to the admitted forgery and fraud, this court is referring the matter of Malcolm Pierce and Evelyn Pierce to the district attorney's office for for immediate criminal investigation. The judge turned her gaze to Langston. Mr. Pierce, the city still has a massive, failing slope threatening the regional water basin. Because the patents are yours, you are the only one who can legally execute a recovery plan. What is your position? Langston slowly stood up to his full height. He looked at the judge, then at the ruined family across the aisle. I will fix the land, Your Honor, Langston said, his voice deep, calm, and absolute. But I will not fix it for the Caldwell Group, and I will not fix it for Pierce and Associates. I will fix it under a new name. 6 months later, the morning sun broke over the western slope, painting the valley in shades of amber and pale gold. The heavy gray mud that had once choked the basin was gone. In its place stood a marvel of natural engineering. The steep hillside had been completely transformed into a series of wide, stepped terraces, stabilized by massive, hand-cut limestone blocks. Runoff water didn't pool or threaten to liquefy the clay anymore. Instead, it trickled gracefully down a hand-carved stone spillway, emptying into a newly restored wetland basin below. A fresh wooden sign stood at the entrance of the public eco-park, its letters deeply carved into a solid slab of salvaged oak, the Pierce Conservation Trust and Park. Down by the water's edge, the air was cool, smelling of damp peat, cedar mulch, and fresh pine. A dozen young willow saplings, their root systems protected by natural jute netting, stood straight and strong along the bank. Langston stood on the lower terrace, his boots in familiar, honest mud. He wore his faded canvas work jacket, his hands resting on the handle of a heavy planting shovel. He looked up at the slope. There was no concrete, no steel rebar, and no high-rise condominiums. It was a living, breathing landscape, designed to bend with the earth rather than force it into a digital mold. Behind him, the low rumble of a flatbed truck faded as Booker Vance cut the engine. Booker walked down the slope, carrying a fresh roll of sod under one arm. He stopped next to Langston, looking up at the green, terraced hillside with a quiet, appreciative nod. We finished the last of the drainage trenches on the north side, Langston, Booker said, wiping sweat from his forehead. The city inspector just signed off on the final soil stability report. He said he's never sloped this solid. Didn't even need to look at a computer screen to know it was done right. Langston smiled, a slow, deep expression that reached his eyes. That's because we built it to breathe, Booker. You give the water a place to go, and the earth won't have to fight you for it. The crew is packing up the tools, Booker said, looking at his old friend with a fierce, quiet pride. We're heading over to the diner to celebrate. You coming? In a minute, Langston replied. I want to finish staking this last row of willows. Booker nodded, clapping a heavy hand onto Langston's shoulder before walking back up the hill. Langston knelt in the damp soil, his fingers gently pressing the rich, dark earth around the base of a young willow sapling. He tied a sturdy canvas strap around its trunk, anchoring it to a cedar stake. He knew that in 10 years, these roots would weave deep into the clay, interlocking with the shale below, creating a barrier that no storm could break. The silence of the valley was peaceful now, no longer heavy with the pain of the past. He had heard from his attorney that Evelyn and Malcolm's trial was approaching. They had lost the high-rise office, the expensive cars, and the social standing they had sacrificed everything to keep. They were facing years of probation and massive financial restitution that would take them a lifetime to pay back. They had wanted a life without the dirt, but in trying to steal the harvest, they had left themselves with nothing but barren ground. Langston stood up, wiping the soil from his hands. He didn't feel anger toward them anymore. The soil had taught him long ago that you cannot grow anything of value on a foundation of rot. He had let them go, leaving them to the winter they had brought upon themselves. He picked up his shovel and slung his canvas bag over his shoulder. As he walked up the stone steps of the terrace, he paused to look back at the water. The sun reflected off the surface of the lake, bright and unbroken, casting a brilliant light over the young forest he had planted. He was 60 years old, starting over with nothing but his name, his hands, and a crew of loyal men. But as he felt the solid, unyielding earth beneath his boots, Langston knew he was finally standing on a